Welcome to Press Coverage. I'm Theo Gremminger. At Press Coverage, I'm looking to have on the sharpest guests and help you find the edges you need to win in fantasy football. And repeat guest, John Daigle, established the run. You always crush when you're on here, John. It's February, so it's a little early for this, but we're going to take a stab at the NFL offseason. Ton of rookie content going around right now, as expected, but we're going to specifically look at this free agent class and also a few players who might get traded, might get cut. We're going to cover a lot today. John, how are you doing today? You guys are putting a lot together with some of the early best ball content over at ETR.
We first launched the ETR first ever best ball package last year around post-draft, a couple weeks after. And that was after I got hired, which was part of the process. We all understood that when me jumping on, I could definitely help out with more of the content side for all of best ball post-draft. This, I will say, this podcast it's going to be a lot of vibes because you have caught me in the 2-week window to where I do the least amount of work. All my Super Bowl content is totally done. We're not going to talk about that today. That's what I know the most about. But I usually, since the offseason is one long process, I usually make sure after the Super Bowl to take a couple weeks off, and then I dive right back into best ball. But I do like to have those couple weeks off to just reset.
Well, listen, anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen in an NFL offseason, it's all vibes at this point.
Yeah.
We're going to attempt to kind of give you a bird's eye view of the free agent class that's on the way. Also, there's not too many, but there could be a few significant trades for fantasy football. And then obviously the cut candidates, that's always an interesting one, especially this year with sort of a very influx quarterback market and a maximum of 3 quarterbacks probably drafted inside of round 1 in the NFL draft. So there's going to be a couple of quarterbacks this year that are not necessarily guys that we'd expect to start like surefire starters. I'd say that there's going to be maybe 3 kind of surprise starter potentials when we get to day 1 of the NFL season. Let's start at the quarterback spot because Sam Darnold had a tremendous season in Minnesota. It did not end well. Certainly the playoff loss was a difficult one to see, and that was sort of an argument for J.J. McCarthy. But Sam Darnold still had 35 touchdown passes, 12 interceptions. This was a significant career turnaround year for Darnold, a guy who's still relatively young as well, and he headlines our free agent class at the quarterback spot. Your thoughts on Darnold?
It's an entirely different conversation after those last 2 games he played, which was who he's been for his entire career. And meanwhile, while he was steady for the entire offseason, there were still issues throughout the regular season that he could still throw multiple interceptions and be turnover prone. That's kind of the issue. He has to hopefully land with another guru. And there are a lot of new young OCs. The Bears OC is the one who's 28 years old, correct?
Yes, the Bears have the 28-year-old. That's awesome.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
It's amazing. So there are a lot of opportunities out there for Sam Darnold to continue growing. But unfortunately, yes, like we saw who Sam Darnold is. And it's good enough to get by as a premier backup in the league for the rest of his career, hopefully now, that he has a lot more confidence. But at the end of the day, yes, those last 2 games were still what stunted him from going back to Minnesota, in my opinion. Seems like they're just going to move forward with J.J. McCarthy.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the even when it was the very, very successful games for Darnold, take away the very end, it was still probably going to be McCarthy because of the power of having a quarterback on a rookie contract. Mm-hmm. They drafted him in the first round, and Darnold was never brought in to be like some long-term answer. He was, brought in to be a bridge quarterback to either open up the season, and then J.J. McCarthy took over. So it sort of like worked out perfectly for Darnold. I do think the market is going to be very flux for him. Vegas, the New York Giants, Cleveland. There's a number of teams here. It's certainly, I'll throw it out there, a return to New York in some sense. Could also be on the table. Tennessee. There's a number of teams that might pass on quarterback in the NFL draft and just go with Darnold. And I think he's young enough that they could paint themselves a picture that he's going to be a potential answer at quarterback. So whatever you think of Darnold, he's still the leader of the pack at the quarterback spot in this free agent class. Now let's link these 2 Pittsburgh quarterbacks together, because Pittsburgh last year moneyballed the quarterback's position. They were able to get Justin Fields and Russell Wilson on incredibly cheap deals. They traded for Fields. They signed Wilson, gave him like a veteran minimum contract. So they got by and actually squeezed a lot out of it, John, in terms of wins and losses, make the playoffs. Obviously, it ended very, very poorly for Pittsburgh. But do you see them retaining one of these two players? And what do you think the market's looking like for a Russell Wilson or a Justin Fields?
I think they retain one of them. Which one? I'm not sure. Most likely, Justin Fields would be cheaper, but also I don't consider him, and I don't think they consider him a starter in the league. So I feel like they would also address it perhaps in the draft or do something else. But I do think they retain one. The issue with Russell Wilson is that he was still Russell Wilson at the end of the year. Like, they went 5 consecutive games where they didn't score more than 17 points. Russell Wilson just threw 1 touchdown over his last 2 regular season starts. And although the box score looked great in the postseason, we all know that was second half garbage time as the Ravens just doused him in the wild card round. So Russell Wilson, I think it's going to be a little bit tougher. Some team always convinces themselves to have a veteran backup, so he'll have no issues finding a job. I feel like the Steelers are probably leaning more into keeping Justin Fields as a backup, though.
That's an interesting take. So, like, the Fields one for me, Russell Wilson, most people I think would say that Russell Wilson gets brought back to Pittsburgh, but I agree with you. I think it's actually Fields makes more sense because Wilson last year, they were able to get so cheap. It becomes a different argument where it's like you got Russell Wilson basically for free. This year, he won enough games and he showed that he's not completely fried, that the market for him is going to be a little bit stronger. Last year, there were people who thought he might retire. So he certainly did enough to like give himself a little bit more longevity. Fields is interesting because Fields, if he gets a job as a starter in fantasy, that's a guy that we're interested because of the rushing ability. And I think it could be a very team-friendly deal. Maybe Pittsburgh drafts a quarterback on day 2 and they have him back up Justin Fields, something like that. But I think that Fields is actually an interesting one. I think there's some validity in taking shots on him as like a late best ball dart throw at quarterback. Would you agree on that?
Oh, absolutely. We saw last year he was a last-round pick, and he responded by returning that investment in his first couple of games. Like, he had a couple starts where he was the overall QB1 of the week.
He was QB6. He was QB6 when they benched him. It was like terrible for us.
So of course, if you get one start out of Justin Fields, he pays off that return like in the last round. So yes, you always take shots on Justin Fields.
For sure. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to discuss a pretty ugly group of free agent running backs.
If you play in Dynasty, you need Dynasty Deluxe, our premium package for Dynasty Leaguers. We rank over 300 players, updated every week, all year long. And there's a win now mode and a rebuild mode with superflex and tight end premium controls. And a Dynasty League sync where you can say, sync down all of my sleeper teams, all my FFPC teams, and then you can browse around your leagues for who has needs, and then you can use our trade finder to see what kinds of trades are happening in leagues that are similar to the one I want to do. Then you can analyze trades using our trade analyzer, which balances the lifetime value, which includes picked values out to like 2028. All of that plus the rookie guide, $25 value is included. So if you're just in one Dynasty League, Dynasty Deluxe is well worth it. And use your host's promo code, and you can bump up to all in and get $25 off.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with John Daigle. And we referenced how bad this running back class is in free agency. Last year was like the greatest free agent running back class ever. This is certainly not that. And it's combined with what is going to be a tremendous group of 2025 rookie backs. So not a whole lot to talk about here, John. We've got to talk about at the top. I would say that the most successful running back over the last few years has been Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones might be the leader of the pack among all free agent running backs. This is also a guy who's over 30 years old, was solid this year in Minnesota. Do you think that there's a team that's going to look at Jones as, hey, I'm going to do exactly what Minnesota did this year. He's going to be my starter. I'm going to mix somebody in. Or do you think it's more likely that Jones ends up as sort of a running back by committee guy just based on his age and sort of the transient nature he's had the last couple of years with playing on 2 teams?
He's such an interesting case study because, yes, coming off Green Bay, he finished his career with 5 consecutive 100-yard performances, including getting a statue risen for him in Dallas as he just owned the zip code basically in the wild card round. And then even so, the Packers, because of his injury issues, let him walk. The Vikings throughout the offseason talk about it being a committee approach with him and Ty Chandler just to keep Aaron Jones healthy. And then he becomes so good with Minnesota that it's not a committee at all, that they just have no choice but to use him. But the fumbles ultimately caught up to him, and that's what got him benched. And so coming off a career high, 306 touches, the first time he's had over 300 touches for his entire career, I'm not sure. I still think there's enough juice in the tank here to be a viable best ball pick at value. And he is, in my opinion, the most exciting running back in the free agent class. But the way he's typically been treated historically, 1, we should expect injury. 2, I do wonder about the fumbling issues. And 3, most likely he will end up in some kind of committee. But again, he's such an explosive player that even as a committee back, at least in best ball, he's definitely worth taking shots at.
Yeah, and I think you nailed that. And he had 50 receptions this year. 250 carries for him was way higher than we would have anticipated before the season. 14 points per game in PPR leagues. For me, Jones, I completely agree with you. I think the RB29 price tag that currently on Underdog, like, you can embrace that in best ball. Now,
Yep.
if this is a dynasty or kind of redraft argument, I think that it becomes a little bit more difficult. But I do think he's got another year left of playing at a pretty high level. The fumbling aside, the quality of play was there. How about Najee Harris? This has been a player where the best ball market is actually treating him like he's going to be in a committee next year, possibly a backup. He's running back 36 right now on Underdog. Najee, another year where Najee was okay. It's been sort of a Najee plays every game. Najee's had several seasons with over 1,000 rushing yards. This year he does it again, gets you 1,000 rushing yards, gets you 6 rushing scores, 12 points per game. He's still relatively young. Could this be a situation where it's a David Montgomery leaves Chicago, the fantasy community is just kind of like, not really excited about him. He lands in Detroit and sort of gets a rejuvenation here? Like, how much gas is in the tank for Najee Harris to go make a fantasy impact next year and return value on this early ADP?
That's the thing, is that even if he ends up in a committee, his stature, his role will still most likely be touchdown equity inside the 5-yard line. So, of course, he can have spike weeks at that current 10th, 11th round cost. So, yes, he could end up as a workhorse because he does a lot of things that coaches love, but even his floor role is perfectly fine in that range. So, yes, as at a 10th round pick, of course, I'm interested in Najee Harris.
Now, how about Jaylen Warren? This is one where Warren could potentially get brought back to Pittsburgh on a cheaper deal. It certainly will be a cheaper deal. This year, he ended the year pretty well. He had 2 games in week 16 and week 17 where people maybe had to use him in their fantasy playoffs, and they had back-to-back games of like 5 receptions, 40-plus receiving yards.
Mm-hmm.
He played well in that game against KC at the end of the year. Your thoughts on Jaylen Warren, sort of the market for him? This could be a sneaky one. You're not getting much of a discount for him. He's still inside of the top 30 running backs on Underdog. But just in terms of NFL value, if Najee walks, I could see Pittsburgh bringing him back.
Yes, but I don't think, and maybe the market wouldn't all either, pay him much, honestly, just based on how they've used him in the past. Now, this year, the premise always in drafting Jaylen Warren, he did provide spike weeks just because he's so explosive. But the idea was always that if Najee Harris were injured, then Jaylen Warren obviously comes in as an RB1. I imagine that's how we continue treating him in best ball because he's shown he still has that immense upside. Also, recall last year for basically the entire first half of the season, battled multiple injuries, including coming into the week 1 with an injury as well. So if we're going to get a full healthy offseason plus a regular season for Jaylen Warren without Najee Harris, that would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. Now, J.K. Dobbins, do you think that this is going to be a market for him? Had some success this year in LA. It was very much a sort of a mixed bag. And of course, he broke down for a good portion of the year. Did he do enough to sort of rejuvenate the market for him, John? Or is it going to be another year where Dobbins is going to get sort of a very low cost kind of team friendly deal?
I think he did enough, but this is the player I'm worried about. Whereas last year we could get him in the 14th, 15th round, and I did have a hard fade on him, even at that cost, because I just could not imagine him being used heavily. And in fact, he was used heavily by the Chargers. But the thing was, he was still the J.K. Dobbins we knew once he escaped those first 2 weeks of the Raiders and Panthers games. Didn't go over 100 yards again for the rest of the season and really just put on touchdown deodorant to hide his inefficiencies. Got the touches, yes, but still 3.8 yards per carry, only 7 touchdowns, or I should say 7 touchdowns the rest of the way across 11 games. And then we saw all of that, especially when he returned from injury. Again, under 3.5 yards per carry. And the postseason, when he doesn't score a touchdown, it looks terrible. So he's a player that I'm really concerned about. I would worry about him getting steamed this year in best ball more than anything.
Yeah, for me, I think he's probably a best ball fade on principle because of the return. Like RB30 for him this year. You referenced it. Where he had 2 of his highest 3 scoring weeks of the year in weeks 1 and week 2. Yeah. And I think it's sort of like that front-loaded production worries me. The guy's had so many injuries, so much tread on the tire. So this will be an interesting one. Similar boat with Javonte Williams, where Javonte Williams obviously didn't have the success of J.K. Dobbins as a runner last year, but Williams did finish top 5 in the NFL in targets at the running back position. Certainly he can catch the ball out of the backfield. Committee back, John, is there a market for Javonte? Any interest in him?
I think there will be interest as a committee back. I don't imagine him separating, though. Now, again, for best ball, for these types of things, he's going to go. What's his ADP right now?
So it's a dead ADP. It's running back 58 for Javonte.
Oh, okay. That's interesting because he showed, as you said, that he can earn targets. And even when he came back from the serious injury a couple of years ago, Sean Payton still entrusted him for a career high in touches. So I don't think it's going to be an expansive market, but someone will definitely bring him in as an RB2 or 3. And I bet we get a couple usable games from him at that cost.
So yeah, I think Javonte is one where if you're looking for a dirt cheap target in your early best ball drafts, or if you're looking for a dirt cheap dynasty target, like I think Javonte still has a little bit left in him. And I think that the pass catching ability will travel. So I think the market's actually beating him up a little too much at that sort of an ADP. How about Rico Dowdle? And I'm surprised we're even kind of talking about Rico Dowdle, but Rico Dowdle ended the season very well. He had over 1,000 rushing yards this year. And that backloaded production where from like week 12 on, he had about 5 weeks that would have helped you as a best ball manager. It seems like the writing's on the wall. Do you kind of think that the Cowboys are going to take Ashton Jeanty if he's available in the first round? A lot of steam with that one. And then do you see them bringing back Dowdle? Will he have a market for him? Will it be heavy interest? Will it be sort of light interest? He's a tough player for me to gauge, John.
I don't think the Cowboys have interest in bringing back Rico Dowdle. That's not really something they do. And under Brian Schottenheimer, I would imagine they try to add to the running back position because you have to remember the Cowboys are always reactionary. They are never proactive with their personnel moves. Thus, I guarantee you they're the one organization that's saying, well, running backs were good in free agency last year. They're not even looking at the player names. They're just going to assume that running backs are good in free agency again this year. So I bet they bring someone else in. Yes, they would take Jeanty if he's available. I don't think he's going to be there whenever it's the Cowboys' time to pick after pick 10. So, yeah, Rico Dowdle's interesting because it was never his fault. It was an organizational downfall, the mistakes they always make every year, that they prioritized Ezekiel Elliott and others over Rico Dowdle all offseason just because that's what they do. It's nepotism in Dallas. The talent doesn't matter. So can Dowdle land elsewhere and then provide usable scores? Of course he can. I just really, as only a second half player and someone who had not done it in the league prior to that, I genuinely don't know what his market will be if other teams will actually be interested.
Yeah, I think that the hope would be sort of a Dowdle ends up earning a handcuff job, which is sort of like what he is. Your thoughts on the Schottenheimer hire in Dallas as the new head coach?
I mean, First of all, I'm still going through the Luka trade where
Oh my gosh.
I'm having an existential crisis literally because I've never abandoned any of my teams growing up in Dallas Fort Worth area, being born there, and now like I have separated from the Cowboys entirely just because I'm in the weeds for football, so I have no passion for teams. I only root for players to get paid. But for the Mavericks, I will still die hard, and now I feel like I have to separate. So about Brian Schottenheimer, that's also a whole other. This is what the Cowboys are. Like it's laziness from the top down. This is why their culture's terrible. This is why they'll never win. This is why you should never bet on them to win the Super Bowl or take them serious in January. This is who they are. And it's a team that does not prioritize winning. You have to view them as an investment. And everyone says, but they're not winning. They're not an investment. No. This is why they're top 5 in Forbes every single year, because they're the best investment. Imagine investing in anything that doesn't do well, but you also still get more money back on your return every year. That's the best investment possible. That's exactly what this is for Jerry Jones. It is nothing more. They will never win. Brian Schottenheimer is a joke. But having said that, they had the talent. They had the personnel, still a top edge in the league in Micah Parsons, still an above average quarterback in Dak Prescott, one of the best receivers in the league. They have the talent. They're going to win 10 games, but it's just not going to matter because we know not to take them seriously.
Yeah, and it will be very interesting to see like which way Dallas goes at the running back position. That's sort of one of the like open ADP riser spots for whoever ends up being the starting running back in Dallas next year. I think Jeanty's an auto pick if he's there. I agree with you. He's going to get selected before them.
Yeah.
You could see New Orleans select him. You could see the Raiders select him. Certainly Chicago with Ben Johnson.
Broncos pick before them as well, right?
Broncos pick after them, but Broncos, but I could see Broncos making a move up.
Yep.
There's so many scenarios with Jeanty, and there's also, John, the potential for he's so good that it could be a mystery team. We didn't necessarily think Detroit was going to be in the mix for Jahmyr Gibbs. They just valued the player so much on draft night. When these sort of elite players are available, there's going to be more teams than we're even thinking about positioning themselves. So Dallas also picks at 44. That's a great landing spot for any of these running backs that happen to fall, a Quinshon Judkins, whoever at 44. That would be a huge one for fantasy football. One more running back to pick your brain on, and an interesting one. Jordan Mason was a great best ball pick this year, and also a really, really good late redraft selection. All the managers who didn't have, Christian McCaffrey available to him, but they handcuffed him with Jordan Mason, they at least had some front-loaded production. He had 4 straight weeks to start the year where he had double-digit PPR points, including 3 games over 17 points scored, had over 700 rushing yards, ended up missing time as well. Did the front-loaded production this year and the ability that he showed in the Shanahan system, your thoughts on Mason versus like a Garendo if you were going to invest in a non-Christian McCaffrey running back in San Francisco? And I'll preface this. Mason, the team has an option to re-sign him, and by all accounts, it sounds like they will.
And that would make sense since Shanahan loves to stack his running back room. I would still prefer Mason, preferably, because whenever he was healthy, he was Shanahan's favorite. And although everyone calls it Shanahanigans and questions who's going to be used, Kyle Shanahan has actually been really good at only using one running back when they've been available. Now it's the matter of how he treats them. They often get injured. Like, that's not a coincidence why they get injured and stay injured, because he runs them into the ground. Because as good as he is at a lot of things, actual like GM and injury management is not his forte. So I still like Mason over Garendo, but I'm going to take both anyhow. And Mason's a player I still just love in general. If he doesn't re-sign there, he'll be interesting because he was averaging over 6 yards per touch before, even this past season. He was a very, very efficient runner. Can't earn targets, but very efficient between the tackles. Someone I believe will see that and prioritize that.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. And I think this could be a Zach Moss situation where if he ever was on the open market, and I think this is a kind of a moot conversation, sure, I think teams would look at him as a committee back, an efficient runner that can absorb contact and handle volume when it's given to him. So I think Mason's sort of an underrated one. I would agree with you, but I think there's a little bit of value in taking a shot in some of these early drafts on a Garendo versus a Mason. Interesting one right there. That sort of wraps up running back. Wide receiver is also not great, but it's much better much better than running back. We have some fun names to talk about. Your gut feel on T. Higgins. Is he a Cincinnati Bengal next year, or is he on another team?
No, I would say 90% sure he's not a Bengal. Like how many times does Joe Burrow have to say it before we know even ownership is ignoring him? That's not how Mike Brown and Cincinnati organization works. I believe they would have got something done anyhow already. I believe what they're seeing is Jamar Chase's extension, and they're just glossing over T. Higgins altogether. So we're going to get Chase back to Cincinnati, but the Bengals ownership 100% is just prioritizing one. I cannot imagine they bring Higgins back at all.
Yeah, and T. Higgins, this is one where the market for him is going to be incredibly high.
As it should be.
And it deserves it. And this year, like, it's a perfect storm for him because he had his best season as a pro in terms of all the metrics. I mean, he obviously missed some time, and people are going to point at that as sort of a negative for Higgins, that the guy never plays a full slate, but averaged 18.5 points per game. He's been a very effective pro in terms of the amount of target share he's able to absorb. There's so much to like about this profile. I think that there'll be a good portion of the league will view T. Higgins as a guy who can step right in as a highly impactful wide receiver one. Is there a landing spot that you're circling that you think could end up happening with Higgins? And John, this could go a million ways. Washington, Tennessee, New England, the list goes on. There's several teams that have the cap space and will have the interest in Higgins.
All of those make sense. Las Vegas stands out as well. I'm sure new ownership will be looking to splurge money. There are a lot of options. It also makes it interesting. Like, we'll talk about Cooper Kupp, but I think teams will probably be looking at making that deal, especially since they were falling head over heels to trade for wide receivers at the deadline just last year. But T. Higgins is the number one option. Washington would be like my preferred situation. I think that'd be the best outcome for everyone. And so that's what I'm hoping for, but I don't have a lean, honestly.
Yeah, and I think New England's going to make a heavy, heavy push. I think New England wouldn't be the worst one because of the lack of target competition. Like T. Higgins getting 150 targets next year, I'm cool with that. The market's treating T. Higgins as a wide receiver one right now. He's wide receiver 12 overall, going ahead of guys like Terry McLaurin, going ahead of Jackson Smith and Jigba, going ahead of Garrett Wilson, ahead of Tyreek Hill. Sort of your thoughts, is the market valuing him correctly? Do you think there's room for him to run up, or do you think he's sort of being drafted where he should be?
I think it's the correct window. If anything, he might come down a little bit depending where he lands, but it is good that for the first time in his entire career, he proved he can out-target Jamar Chase. He can be better than Jamar Chase when they were on the field together. And we haven't seen T. Higgins' ceiling since clearly he already grew another level just last year.
Yeah, so for me, I agree with you. I think that this is one where I want to be aggressive with T. Higgins. I think it's worth trading for in Dynasty. I think it's worth taking in early, fast draft or underdog best ball drafts. He's definitely a player that's going to be treated as a wide receiver one. No Jamar Chase next to T. Higgins. Let's see how he does in that situation. He'll also be a guy that gets wrapped up into a significant contract. I think at the bare minimum, he's going to get one of these sort of 3-year deals. Mm-hmm. If not, it's going to be more like a 5-year deal. So a team's going to go very, very hard at T. Chris Godwin looked like the league winner last year at the wide receiver spot. We sort of had a revolving door of this guy's the league winner, this guy gets hurt, Rashee Rice, Chris Godwin. But Godwin was terrific last year with Liam Cohen, averaged 20 points per game level, then goes down for the season. Really terrible certain situation. It was at the Baltimore game, a clear loss, and they had Godwin on the field at the very end of the game, gets hurt with like a minute to go. Could have completely changed the trajectory of a lot of fantasy seasons. That being said, your gut feel with Godwin, where I think that the market's treating him like he's going to be on a new team next year. I'm not so sure of that. Which way are you leaning? Do you think Godwin's going to return to Tampa Bay, or do you think he's going to be on another team?
I was thinking about this yesterday, actually. I feel like he will be prioritized going back to Tampa Bay. I do wonder if they'll get even a little bit of a discount coming off the injury. I also wonder if he's going to be at full strength coming off the injury. And that's really my concern is maybe it shouldn't be my concern for best ball since it comes down to the end of the year. But how he starts like the first month and a half, I think is more concerning for redraft than anything.
Yeah, I think that he's going to be a Tampa Bay Buck. It's just my gut feel.
Sure.
I've been mocking them to draft a wide receiver at 19 in my early mock drafts, but when you start looking at it, it's like the success that Godwin's had in this system, playing with Baker Mayfield. They have Josh Grizzard now as the OC, so they promote from within. So having a continuity with Godwin, Evans, Jalen McMillan, Cade Otton, and then the emerging Bucky Irving at running back, like this is an offense we can get a little bit of excited about. And I think it kind of like makes sense for them to just commit to Godwin, pay him, and not let him test the market. If he does go elsewhere, I think that there's going to be a significant market for him. He's been linked to Jacksonville, going with Cohen there. Obviously, I think he'd be a New England priority if they don't get Higgins. So I think Godwin's going to have a market despite the injury last year, John, because this is a guy who was just so good last year. And I think it's a drop-off in the free agent marketplace after Chris Godwin. I'll throw these guys all kind of lumped together here. Stefon Diggs as coming off of an injury, and Amari Cooper coming off of a significant downward spiral in his quality of play and the number of snaps that he's was on the field for. The market for Diggs and Cooper, do you have interest in either of these guys?
Cooper, yes. Diggs' injury is concerning, especially at his age coming off of it, which will now be his third team most likely in the last 3 years. But for Cooper, I still blame his first half of the season when he was still good. He was still leading the team in targets, but I blame his performance on Deshaun Watson, and Cooper was still a full-time player. Whenever Cooper went to Buffalo, obviously, I don't know how or why he was treated as such, but they also treated all of their receivers like that. Even for like as much hype as Khalil Shakir got, he wasn't anyone that really scared you like in weekly DFS contests and everything, because the way they use him was more of a possession slot receiver and not like a guy who scored touchdowns. The only times he ever beat you in fantasy was, of course, the 2 indoor games back-to-back against the Lions and the Rams the Bills played. So I think Cooper's usage the second half of the season, especially in the playoffs, just boiled down to Joe Brady and the coaching staff egregiously using their players more than anything. So I'll definitely take shots on Cooper.
Yeah, Cooper could be a bounce back candidate, and I think he's one that's being completely overlooked. Like he played so well in Cleveland with Joe Flacco, and then I actually was super excited about this move to Buffalo. Obviously, like many were, and it was like nothing there. One player who is super interesting, Keenan Allen, is going to turn 33 years old. He still comes off of a 70 catch season. And when Chicago made the coaching change, they saw Keenan Allen like become a target monster once again. He had 4 games with 20 points or more to finish the season, including a 29-pointer against Detroit, that 9-catch, 140-yard game, which was just incredible. But this is a player that I think there will be a market for him as sort of a one-year wonder. Your thoughts on Allen?
Yeah, there will definitely be a market, but we're still talking about a career low in yards per game, which is sticky year to year, a career low in yards per target, which is less sticky, but still tells you something. So the fact he could earn targets from the slot, that's why he will sign with their team. But also we just need to make sure we are ahead of it, similar to like the Tyler Lockett downfall, because these things change overnight. So it's really going to depend on his ADP going into like post-draft, how I value him or not.
Yeah, and I will be interested to see if it's an early signing. So a lot of times, like, I don't know if this is even an exact science because Derrick Henry certainly wasn't one of the first guys signed.
Right.
But I love to see like a team sign somebody on like day one. If somebody goes and gets Keenan Allen in like the first 48 hours of free agency, I'm going to be like, okay, there might be a plan there. Agreed that the quality has slipped, but he's still a target earner. He's still a guy that can play the slot. He might have one more year of like wide receiver 4 level in him. And the market's treating him as wide receiver 58. So I think that's ADP's probably correct for a player of his age and an unknown team situation. I don't think it's an extreme value, but I don't think it's an avoid.
Agree with you.
And rounding out the wide receiver spot, this player is actually quite interesting. Hollywood Brown, who we were excited about, John, in terms of his potential impact in Kansas City, obviously came back towards the end of the year. Hollywood Brown is one where, do you think he's going to end up having to sign another prove-it deal? Do you think Kansas City potentially just brings him back? Or do you think that this is a player that the market might be a little bit more aggressive towards? I don't know which way to go with this one. I certainly liked how he played in Arizona at times, and I think that there could be a market for him. Your thoughts on this one?
I was going to say the opposite, because I don't feel like, even knowing the injury, he did enough to really garner a market. I think he may have to be forced to sign another 1-year prove-it deal. If he comes back to Kansas City, I can't imagine it's anything more than a year. I think they would just treat him like DeMarcus Robinson and just keep on bringing him back for 1 year at a time. He showed enough to play over DeAndre Hopkins throughout the playoffs. But again, because of the injury and barely seeing him, I just don't think he did enough to really warrant a big contract.
It'll be very interesting. It probably might be another year with a 1-year prove-it deal. I wonder what the market will be, because a lot of the competition for him, this free agent class kind of leaves us wanting a lot more, just like the running back class. I think you nailed it, John. This is one where very excited to talk to you about T. Higgins, very excited to talk to you about Chris Godwin. And then the rest, it's like not a whole lot left on the table. There's a few other wide receivers. Certainly we could have covered those ones, but I think these are the most significant. If you guys want to hear about guys like Darius Slayton, I'm sure some other podcast will be talking about that one, but we're going to avoid that. Tight end is also another position where it's just not that exciting. The most successful tight end available this offseason is going to be Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz played well this year. He certainly came in and exceeded expectations, held Ben Sinnott completely off the field. The second-round pick Sinnott didn't do anything, and Ertz ended up finishing as a tight end 1, showed the ability to handle targets, meshed well with Jaden Daniels. Do you think Washington just brings back Zach Ertz?
Yes, and Ertz is at the point of his career where he'd take a discount to be in a friendly situation as well. Considering they made the conference championship, I imagine he views them as a championship team. So Ertz, I would say 100% going back to Washington. I'm not even pegging him anywhere else. I just think it's a guarantee.
Any interest at all in Tyler Conklin, who had 2 solid seasons in a row? This year fell off a bit. This has been a guy who catches the football well. Do you think any team is going to view Conklin as a starting tight end, or do you think it's more like hey, this is almost like a tight end by committee type, where he's going to end up being drafted outside of tight end 2 land when it's all said and done in August?
He'll be a floor-based tight end by committee, at least with someone like Juwan Johnson you mentioned. Johnson has shown like he can be a touchdown machine. Conklin was really a guy who earned targets from Aaron Rodgers underneath and offered a high reception floor, but not really the ceiling we want. So you can take, I'll never argue against anyone's late round tight end, whatever. Throw darts at everyone. Hopefully it works out. But I would probably be more excited personally about Juwan than Conklin.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. I think Juwan Johnson is actually the sort of underrated one in this tight end class, because he's 28 years old. He's sort of like he is a converted wide receiver, but he's sort of like an overgrown wide receiver. Early ADP is tight end 32. I think there's going to be a market for Juwan Johnson. Again, it's a year where there's not a whole lot at the tight end position. And there's enough with this profile that someone might like him. This could be it's not quite a Jonnu Smith situation, but I think this could be sort of like a Mike Gesicki to Cincinnati situation last year, somewhere between Gesicki and Jonnu. I think the market will treat him where some team's going to say, you know what, I can use Juwan Johnson as my starting tight end. The guy catches the ball well. There's been a number of years where we sort of wanted a little bit more, but he did have the 7 touchdown a year in 2022. He's a red zone threat, and he's young enough.
I completely agree with you. That's the kind of players I prioritize at the end of drafts, or guys who have a proven record of scoring touchdowns. Although touchdowns are not sticky, being used in that area of the field is. And Juwan Johnson is a guy who would be schemed up in that area of the field for sure on his next team.
Yeah, so we're also going to touch base on trade candidates. And this is probably a wasted 10 minutes of our time, John, because most of these guys are not going to get traded. But let's start out with one who looks like he will be traded. Cooper Kupp is going to leave LA. LA is going to trade him. LA already said that they would eat some of the contract to help him move along and kind of get this deal done. Who LA has as their wide receiver 2 becomes another very intriguing fantasy conversation, whether that's in the draft or a trade or a free agent. But let's concentrate on Cooper Kupp. 14 points per game this year, still was a 23-ish% target share guy, 32 years old. He's very, very motivated. He's missed time in multiple seasons now. Is there a team that you would get excited about seeing Cooper Kupp on? Is there a situation where you think could be a great fit for him? Sort of your gut feel with this Cooper Kupp going to the market thing.
I think Chicago would be the best landing spot for him. Ben Johnson and the Bears still need, after Keenan Allen's exit, a slot receiver for 3 wide sets. Plus, Ben Johnson could do so much with Cooper Kupp as a power slot receiver. I know he faded those last 6 games, I believe it was, but I also think that was more about the Rams becoming a run-heavy offense and changing the identity of what they were headed into the postseason. Not really Cooper Kupp's fault because the volume wasn't there, since Puka Nacua was also growing another level before our very eyes in the second half of the season when he returned from injury. So I know everyone says Kansas City. I think that's better like in Madden because Kansas City's not a fun offense, not to mention that Rashee Rice will be back next year, and Rice showed he can dominate targets as well, just from the style of play they have. So I think Chicago would be my personal favorite pick for Kupp.
Yeah, and you're rocking the Chicago tee, so it makes sense.
This is actually this is my rec league Chicago tee. I just got out of physical therapy because that shows my age, by the way.
There you go. We're not gonna age ourselves, John, on this podcast. So I will say that for me, I think that Washington, we talked about Ertz last year as an older guy, goes to Washington, sort of fits in well. I think Kupp and McLaurin coexisting on the offense, I think that would be perfectly fine. Houston would not be the worst outcome with their need for a wide receiver, with Tank Dell going to miss the season, Diggs on his way out.
Houston's a good call. I didn't think about that.
Houston, I think that could be one. There's been rumors potentially to just move across town to LA. I don't know if that's just sort of wish casting it. But there'll be a market for Kupp. It just comes down to, can he stay on the field? But I do think that this is one where I don't foresee him returning to wide receiver 1 land. I think that ship has sailed.
No.
But I think that he could give us a low-end wide receiver 2 season in some of the situations that you mentioned. Let's talk about we talked about Dallas. Now, I like the head coaching hire of Aaron Glenn in New York. You're an Aaron Glenn hire is good fan, or you have a different take on that one?
I think it's similar to the initial Ron Rivera hire with the Commanders, and that the Jets just needed a personnel change from the top down. They needed an entire culture change. And so I think Aaron Glenn is good from that standpoint. I don't know. So I believe he's going to at least be like Dan Campbell, and that he will 100% be hands off the offense. And that's exactly what they need. They need him to focus on defense and then lean more into coaching culture and allow the offense to do their own thing and grow into an OC role. And so I believe that's how he's going to treat it. And so that's going to be the best bet for him.
Yeah, I do think he's a get everything sort of back to normal, get it right type hire. But this is a team where there could be a lot of guys in flux. There's been rumors of Garrett Wilson getting traded. That's been going on for about 2 months now. Obviously, the Davante Adams trade to New York. This was one where Garrett Wilson's target share dropped alongside Davante Adams. Davante Adams was certainly the top option to end the season. Counting stats wise, it was a very good season for Wilson. But again, it was a mixed bag if you looked in the game in, game out. Then Davante Adams. Davante Adams seems tethered to Aaron Rodgers. If Aaron Rodgers gets retained by New York, which is a whole nother question mark, then I think Adams will be back in New York. If not, it's kind of hard to foresee that. And then Breece Hall. Breece Hall's been rumored. Last year, the Jets select 2 running backs on day 3, and Breece Hall, they don't necessarily want to pay. So Breece Hall's been a guy that's been the fantasy community's been very, very big fans of Breece Hall. I don't know if it's internally quite as high in New York, and we don't necessarily know with the new coaching staff there. Your gut feel on these three guys in New York, who's back, who's gone, and does anybody know at this point?
No one knows, but I can't imagine them bringing back Aaron Rodgers, who only played well after the Jets were eliminated from the postseason, because that's an Aaron Rodgers thing to do. I cannot imagine the fan base accepting him back. I know they've had it bad, but he literally collapsed an entire organization single-handedly. And if he's not back, that guarantees Davante Adams is not going to be there, because Adams is not playing without Rodgers. So he'll probably ask for his trade out. Breece Hall, I think Breece Hall's fine. I generally don't think they move away from Breece Hall. Plus, like, the market for a running back, I don't think it's that easy to find someone who Breece Hall's an amazing player, but I don't think it's that easy to like find someone who will just take him on for anything more than like a 4th round pick, just because that's how the market works. So Breece Hall, I think, stays. The other two, I believe, are gone.
Now, DK Metcalf, there's been some rumors there in Seattle. Seattle has very bad cap situation, and it's been a long-standing rumor here that they might move on from DK. This year, we saw Jackson Smith and Jigba take big steps forward. They have their kind of target hog wide receiver 1. They obviously made the switch to a Clint Kubiak this offseason at OC. DK could be on the way out. I think, like, a lot of times I hear these rumors and I sort of dismiss them, but based on the cap situation, I think this one could happen. Your gut feel with how you see things playing out with DK in Seattle?
I haven't honestly put much thought into DK. That doesn't mean he won't be going. I think it's a bit tougher to trade him. I could see the Raiders and Pete Carroll being interested in being reunited. That stands out. But I think it probably would be a draft day trade more than anything that comes down to the wire.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how the market values a DK Metcalf, just in terms of draft capital equity that a team might have to trade. You also start looking at teams with cap space. We brought up Washington once again. Vegas is a great call on your part. I do think that we'll see a few former Seattle Seahawks connection type players with Pete Carroll. He just seems like that kind of guy. Metcalf's one where the production it's more like the idea of DK Metcalf has been better for several seasons than the actual production. He has one season where he was a wide receiver 1 in terms of points per game in his entire career. And I think that DK, I'm not sure, but I do think this is one where my gut feel is the initial early ADP of wide receiver 27 might be a little bit high for him this year. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, probably a little high, if only because, again, we don't know the landing spot. And also now we're probably talking about, you could make the case that he was less efficient when he returned from injury because of the injury. And that's when Jackson Smith and Jigba really emerged in the second half of the season. And so DK Metcalf at full strength, can he get back to still being like the first half of the season guy where he was due for regression more than anything because he was still earning targets? I don't know. He's a complicated player, quite honestly. His ADP will probably be higher than we want it to be at the end of the day.
That's usually the case when it comes to DK Metcalf in terms of public consensus ADP wise versus should we be targeting him in our drafts. Now, Mark Andrews had a roller coaster ride of a season. Starts out the year coming off the tightrope surgery, starts out very slowly. It's complete panic, John, after that Kansas City game. Isaiah Likely goes absolutely nuts. Then throughout the year, Andrews ends up catching 11 touchdowns. The sentiment sort of shifts.
Crazy.
Then we get to the playoffs and we have the unbelievably awful drop. Really a poor way to go out for Andrews. That last game was a very forgetful game for him. Your thoughts on them, Baltimore potentially moving on from Andrews? And sort of the argument is they have a tight end that's ready to rock in Isaiah Likely that's been successful continually when he's had opportunities without Mark Andrews. Do you see them potentially moving on from Andrews? I think this would be a player where they would be a significant market for him.
Teams would be interested, but I don't think they move on from him. He's too heavy into the culture of Baltimore. He is like one of the faces of their franchise. So no, I can't imagine Baltimore moving on from him, and instead just continuing to lean into more 12 personnel with Isaiah Likely as they did this year.
And your thoughts on Likely? Do you see next year being a sort of breakout year for him and them sort of embracing him a little bit more? Or do you think it's going to be more of the same that we saw this year and just as is with the two tight ends playing and a lot of Andrews, a lot of Likely?
Since Andrew is really reliant on touchdowns still over the second half of the season, you could see a situation where Likely, as he continues to grow, eventually earns the more targets than Andrews, and that's what we need to be ahead of. So he will not come with the cost. He's still like the only quote-unquote handcuff tight end that goes in like those double-digit rounds. But we've seen that at least last year we saw, at least with Andrews on the field, Likely also had games where he could provide value and be a top 5 tight end and provide a usable score at his price. So I think he'll still be like from round 12 on, and that's still worth taking shots on, especially since last year, again, we saw him have standalone production.
And right now on early ADP, Mark Andrews, tight end 6, Isaiah Likely, tight end 15. So you're not getting that usual Isaiah Likely discount. But I think the market is correct. It's sort of like the early Tyjae Spears ADP, where we were projecting him to potentially have the backfield to himself. You got to take your shots in these major tournaments. And then, of course, the market will adjust as it moves along. But Likely, definitely a very talented player. I thought what was interesting was Elijah Arroyo at the Senior Bowl has this fantastic Senior Bowl out of Miami. And he says that he likes to watch game tape of Sam Laporta and Isaiah Likely. So the young kids are into Isaiah Likely right now as well. It's a sort of a definitely like a nose ball type comment by Arroyo. 2 quarterbacks before we close this out. Derek Carr in New Orleans, potential trade candidate, and Kirk Cousins. There's going to be a market for Kirk Cousins. The quality of the play for Cousins was very poor this year. They kept him as a starter for longer than they should have before switching over to Penix. Could we see a team like the Jets? Is there going to be a few teams that say, you know what, I can fix him with Cousins?
Cousins, there will definitely be a market for, because teams still convince themselves into a player like him, a veteran player who's been successful across multiple teams. Plus, you can easily sell yourself on, well, he was his first year off the torn Achilles. I don't think he gets much better than that, but teams will convince themselves. So there will be a market for Kirk Cousins. For Derek Carr, I mean, we've seen the ceiling. We've seen the floor, which is disastrous. It's more like a third-string quarterback. I think a name like Derek Carr will still bring a couple teams to be interested in trading for him as a backup or a committee situation, maybe like a bridge to a rookie. But I cannot imagine he stays in New Orleans.
Yeah, it's definitely neither one gets you excited at all.
No.
I do think that the market, the early ADP on Kirk Cousins, if you're playing best ball, QB 35, if he's a starting quarterback, he's going to beat that. He still had 18 touchdown passes, but they happen to all be against Tampa Bay, John. So not really, but a lot of them were against Tampa Bay this year. So I'll also throw out one player we didn't go over that could be a cut candidate or a sneaky trade candidate, David Njoku. There was some rumors last year around the trade deadline when Cleveland was unloading everyone. I think just a great deal of flux in that organization. John, let everybody know once again where they can find your work and what you have coming out in February, March, anything you want to talk about.
Bringing back the available targets, air yards, and carries trackers for after the Super Bowl for the ETR best ball package at establishedrun.com. And from that point forward, Justin Herzig is really just building it up. That way you're prepared for all contest in pre-NFL draft best ball. Afterwards, that's when we'll be launching the very big package. But for now, we're just really gathering everything to make sure everyone's ready for that 2-month window until the draft in Green Bay.
Highly recommend all of John's work. It's absolute fire over there at ETR. And stick with us here at Press Coverage. We're going to be getting you ready for everything you need to know this offseason. Coming back with some rookie content, coming back with some early ADP takeaways. We will see you soon.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.